The Tacoma event FAQ has been released. Now this is interesting only because it is a Games Workshop run event, so this is a Games Workshop FAQ. The FAQ is not for 40k games anywhere and everywhere, it's just this one event. But it gives an indication of what could come later this month as a fix. A big test for the rules patch. An attempt, a first attempt. A good try at fixing some of the worst problems, but not all of the problems. This is Games Workshop doing additional testing before they release the first FAQ, after it looks like they didn't do much testing of the actual rules before they released them. Hence my hour and a half worth of explanation of the errors that I've spotted so far in Warhammer 40,000's 11th edition. I'm not just going to read this document to you, I'm going to explain why the FAQ is here, what problem it tries to fix, and if it does fix that problem. Or clarifies the situation so that something that looks like a terrible, horrible nerf is in fact a terrible, horrible nerf. And I won't be mentioning everything that's in the document, as many of these were copied over from 10th edition and you will be used to them, or their clarifications on rules which work the way I said they did. You don't need me pointing at things like dead models don't give the unit their keywords. Works how I said it did previously. Or the beacon secondary mission. If your beacon unit dies for that secondary mission, you don't pick a new unit to be the beacon. This is the only secondary mission you can fail, all others you score later. Step 1. Generating command points. Excluding the command point you get in the command phase, you can gain a maximum of 1 command point per battle round. That includes discarding a secondary mission for a command point. This is a rule that was in 10th edition, it's a rule that's in the Doubles Companion, it's a rule that was otherwise missing from the 40k rules. Even the rules on the app, which are an extension of what is considered the core rules, which also lacks many core rules. So no getting a command point from Junith Eruita and from discarding a secondary mission in the same battle round. It's a maximum of 1. You can only make 1 normal move per phase. That's to stop you doing 2 reactive moves from 2 different sources to move twice. Like having a Kelmorph use his on datasheet ability to move after the enemy moves, and then using Prowling Adjutant to move again in the same phase. You can only make 1 normal move per phase, and the special reason I'm mentioning this is because some people will read this as turn. You can only make 1 normal move per turn, and think that abilities like the Seraphim and the Gargoyles, who can make a normal move, then shoot, then make another normal move, would somehow stop working. 1 is a move in a movement phase, 1 is a move in a shooting phase, those are different phases, so that's still okay. Fight on Death has an interesting interaction when it comes to overrun moves, because you could have a unit fight on death and block an enemy that is eligible to fight from doing an overrun move into another enemy, because the fight on death models are not removed from the board. This fight on death expansion 050405 says the models stay on the battlefield until the end of the phase or until they've attacked, and in the meantime they are physically present on the board, they can use their datasheet abilities, and they can be targeted by stratagems. The targeted by stratagems was a debated one for last edition, but also last edition models fighting on death were not selected to fight, so they couldn't use any abilities that triggered when they were selected to fight. For example, the Arcoflagellants can increase the number of attacks they make when selected to fight. In 10th edition they were fighting out of sequence and the unit wasn't selected to fight. Now they can use such abilities. Okay, this next one I'm going to talk about is referring to things like the Dark Eldar Archon Shadowfield or the Blade Guard's ability to reroll invulnerable saves of 1. First thing, the A and the Q are the wrong way around. The top part should be the question, the bottom part should be the answer. As I said, these FAQs were produced by Games Workshop. So, my unit has an ability which triggers when making a save roll for a specific model in the unit or a specific type of save. Like invulnerable save, how do you resolve it? So their abilities are only active when the model is part of the allocation group, meaning that the Archon's Shadowfield ability, which prevents you from re-rolling invulnerable saves, isn't active if you're making saves for the Cabalites, and you could use a command reroll to reroll one of the Cabalite saves. The second part is saying there's no real difference between an invulnerable save and an armor save in 11th edition. Ignore references to specific types of saves, it's just saves. So the Blade Guard, who could reroll invulnerable saves of 1 but not armor saves of 1 in 10th edition, now they just reroll saves of 1. Armor saves or invulnerable saves, doesn't matter. And for the Archon, when they start taking hits, they have an invulnerable save of 2+ until they fail their first save. So as I understand this working for the Archon, if they were with 5 Cabalites and you rolled 12 saves with an equal distribution, the 2 1s, the 2 2s, and 1 of the 3s would kill the Cabalites, and then all of the rest of the attacks would be stopped by the Archon's 2+ invulnerable save. If the Archon was then hit by 2 more attacks from another weapon, they are the allocation group. If they rolled a 1 and a 2, their invulnerable save is failed, so they lose their invulnerable save, and then the 2 is also failed because they're on their armor save of 4+. That's how I understand the Archon ability to work now. The next one is referring to a problem that we have with the app. The app is a thing you can use to track battles and do scoring in the game. The app, at least, considers anything scored at the end of the game to happen in Battle Round 5. This means anything big like getting 10 victory points for taking your opponent's home means very little if you scored 14 victory points from other aspects of the primary mission. You would instead get 1 victory point instead of 10 more victory points. The way it's meant to be is you'd score 14 victory points for your primary and then separately, at the end of the game, get another 10 victory points. This makes it really easy to get to maximum scoring on your primary mission if you're winning the game, if you've wiped out your opponent. I'm saying regardless of disposition, and I'll have a disposition video coming soon, focus on wiping out the enemy. Scoring at the end of the game is very easy after that. This next section is going to be all about transports and vehicles and things like that. I raised a question about Kharn the Betrayer, especially Kharn the Betrayer as an example, and using abilities within transports. Unlike in 10th edition, there's nothing to say abilities of units do not work within transports. If you have your Primus embarked within a Goliath truck, they can use their decoys and misdirection ability. But you can't use any abilities that say you have to be within 6 inches of something because you're not measuring from the transport, you're measuring from a unit that's not on the battlefield. So just like being in Deep Strike, you are off the table, you cannot measure onto the table. And specifically, Kharn the Betrayer's ability, the Betrayer, will activate. Whereas anything shooting related, such as a Space Marine Lieutenant giving their unit lethal hits, and then 2 of your tactical squad fire from the top hatch of the Rhino, that's using the firing deck ability, and under the firing deck rules, it isn't the unit inside that's shooting, it's the transport. The unit inside has, for rules purposes, passed their guns to the transport, which also means that any hazardous tests you have to take from overcharging plasma weapons, if it's failed, the transport takes the wounds, not the people inside. Then many units lose the frame keyword. A lot of these are flyers, but also the Custodes bikes. What Custodes players with their jet bikes could do was measure from the tip of the spear. Because it had the frame keyword, you don't use the base for measuring, you use every part of the model. You could start your jet bikes facing backwards, have a free pivot around the base, and now their prow and lance are sticking 2 or 3 inches out of their deployment zone, and then you move, essentially gaining a bunch of inches of movement. They could also block enemies over more than 9 inches, as all of the unit is within 9 inches of all of the models, and their spear tips as part of the models also had a 2-inch no you can't come within engagement range of me. This was known as touching tips. Without the frame keyword, it's reduced down to just the base. And it's this interaction that is why the Custodes bikes have lost the frame keyword, but Samael, the dude on the jet bike that's Dark Angels, he hasn't lost it. The reason a lot of flyers have lost frame is so you only measure to and from the base, they all have a base, and you're not measuring from the wingtip, which might be within 2 inches of a model on an upper floor. Or the charge that's 7.5 inches away from a base, you need to roll an 8. A 6 would be successful because you could end within 5 inches vertically of the wing. That's not quite right. Then many Eldar units gained frame, which is something they needed. Their Legends units got the frame keyword, their Codex units didn't. So things like the Wave Serpent, the Falcon, and the Fire Prism, these have really tiny bases but a massive hull. If you had to measure only from the base, you could only get into engagement range between the wings at the front or by touching the engine at the back. Now you can get within 2 inches of any part of the model and you are in engagement range of them. Disembarking is now a lot easier. The rule for setting up large models excludes aircraft now, because some of these massive aircraft are on bases that are more than 6 inches wide. So the base couldn't fully fit onto the table, which meant that they couldn't shoot, which meant they couldn't do anything because their whole job was to turn up, shoot, never allowed to move, and then leave the board. So there is even an event clarification to say, yeah, the Tiger Shark can make ranged attacks. It's how it's meant to be in the rules, rather than what the rules actually say, which prevented it from playing the game. In my last big video, I mentioned that the Adepta Sororitas in the Bringers of Flame detachment have a stratagem that allows a transport to advance, and then the unit inside can disembark. Under the rules, because the transport had advanced, they couldn't make any kind of disembark move other than an emergency disembark move, and would be flinging themselves bodily into rocks and smashing themselves onto the ground in their desperation to get out of the fast-moving transport. Now you've done a rapid disembark. So you can disembark, but you cannot move anymore, you're still able to shoot, you can't charge. And finally with transports, dedicated transports had a rule in 10th edition in the army construction part in the core rules to say if you didn't have anything start within a dedicated transport, it was destroyed before the game began. There are no army construction rules in the book that is the core rules of 11th edition, but in the app, where it describes army construction, there was no mention of this similar rule. Now that rule has come back. Dedicated transports must have a unit inside, otherwise they're destroyed, but without triggering deadly demise. So empty rhinos explode. Goliath rock grinders do not, because though they are transports, they're not a dedicated transport. Next, we're going to look at the Lord of Deceit and Vect abilities. Depends how long you've been playing, whether you know it as Vect or Lord of Deceit. Or if you joined the game recently, you may have only known it as Vect, even though officially in the 10th edition rules, it was called the Lord of Deceit. These kind of rules increase the cost of a stratagem. Now, they were changed, most of them, not all of them, most of them were changed in 11th edition to say, once per turn, you can pick an enemy unit within 12 inches that's trying to use a stratagem and increase the cost of that stratagem by 1. In 10th edition, it was every unit trying to use a stratagem within 12 inches. The explanation in this FAQ for Tacoma explains what happens if there isn't enough command points, or if you do have enough command points, do you still have to use the increased cost stratagem? So if the opponent doesn't have the necessary command points, no command points are spent, the stratagem doesn't work, but the stratagem counts as being used, so you cannot use it on another unit in the same phase. If they wanted to use Armor of Contempt, and they had 1 command point and it cost 1 command point, but you've changed it so that it costs 2 command points, they keep their 1 command point, Armor of Contempt doesn't happen, they can't use Armor of Contempt on a different unit in the same phase. The next paragraph is a bit more controversial. If the opponent does have the necessary number of command points, then they must continue to use the selected stratagem at the increased cost. So in that same example, if my opponent had 2 command points and they wanted to use Armor of Contempt, my Calidus assassin within 12 inches points at them and says it costs 2 command points, they have to spend 2 command points. That's very crippling because your opponent probably had plans for that other command point, and now those plans are utterly foiled because of this ability. It's going to be hard to think of this as anything other than a gotcha. You'll have to say to your opponent, just so you know, if you use that stratagem within 12 inches, I could increase the cost of it, and you have 2 command points, so it would cost all of your command points. Are you sure you want to use that stratagem? And then I'll say whether or not I'm using this ability. But haha, that now costs all your command points. Ooh, you're going to lose the game, because now you can't do a fallback and shoot somewhere else. That sort of thing's going to come up, and that's going to be horribly annoying. I think this FAQ would be better if it said, even if the player had the command points for the increased cost, they still don't have to use the stratagem. But the stratagem still counts as having been used this phase. There's a section about enhancements and epic heroes. Now, epic heroes cannot have enhancements, but units they're attached to can have enhancements. This is how it works on the app. And you can also give an enhancement to a character, add it to a unit, and add the epic hero to the same unit. I could put an enhancement on a Hospitaller, attach it to some Sacrosands, also attach the epic hero Junith Erewhita to the same unit, The unit has epic hero as a keyword, the unit also has an enhancement, but this is fine. This time the app is showing how it's intended to work. Now charge moves. Because of the changes to charge moves, you don't pick charge targets first anymore. You roll some dice, you check if there's any units within that distance, they can then be picked as charge targets, then you move your unit towards your charge targets. You don't select charge targets before rolling any dice. So if you had an ability like Take to the Skies, or the Eldar Warlock has an ability to make enemies -2 to their charge roll if they're picked as a charge target. How does this work? So in the example of Take to the Skies, you say you're going to take to the skies before you roll the charge dice. So in this picture example, pretend this bike in the center had the ability to fly and could take to the skies. They would say they're taking to the skies because they really want to get over those boxes and charge that enemy in the top right. They roll the dice, find that with the -2, they're not eligible to charge them. At that point, they could pick a different charge target. Or in the example of a unit charging some guardians with an Eldar Warlock. They would roll the dice, see that they're eligible to charge the Warlock, then the modifier would kick in, moving that 9 down to a 7, and they needed to get an 8. At that point, you could pick a different charge target within 9 inches. More units have been given mobile. I said that there were several characters who in 10th edition had the ability to move through terrain. In 11th edition, they didn't have that rule. So Belisarius Call, the Lion, Primarchs generally, Fulgrim, the Red Terror, they all have the mobile keyword. They can move through the green dense terrain as if it's not there. Same as infantry. It also applies to Thulia Gould, who now has a redundant ability on their datasheet. And I think one of the stratagems also let Fulgrim move through terrain as if it's not there. You don't need to use that anymore at this Tacoma event. Now a shooting thing. How does it work if some models in the unit are fully visible to some models, but not all of the models in the shooting unit? So we have these eliminators that are shooting at an enemy unit. 2 of the eliminators can only see models in cover, 1 eliminator can see a model that's not getting the benefit of cover. At this point, you split out the eliminators, even if they have the same weapons, because some of them have their ballistic skill modified by the benefit of cover. The eliminator on the right will be hitting on ballistic skill 3+, their normal ballistic skill, because they can see models in the enemy unit that are not getting the benefit of cover. Whereas the eliminator on the left, they cannot see any models outside of cover, they can only shoot at models in cover, so they roll their hit rolls with a modified ballistic skill, so they're hitting on a 4+. This was how most people thought it should work, but others believed it was an all or nothing. One of my models can see at least one of your models outside of cover, therefore none of your models get the benefit of cover. It's on a per model basis. Right, abilities that let you use things for free, but the thing that you're using for free doesn't exist anymore in 11th edition. So anything referring to getting to use the grenade stratagem now says explosive stratagem, tank shock refers to crushing impact. Which crushing impact Games Workshop? For there are 2 different stratagems that have the crushing impact word, and if you search in the Games Workshop app, both of them come up. Perhaps you need to further clarify the crushing impact stratagem in the core rules, unless you've foreseen that the Bully Boys stratagem is not going to be called this in the upcoming Orc Codex. But even then, if this wording was in the July rules patch, we will have several months where it could refer to 2 different stratagems. I know a lot of this was common sense, but that common sense is based on you having played 10th edition and then 11th edition and knowing what the 2 stratagems refer to because they're very similar. New players didn't have that luxury. New players could get confused. This is a necessary FAQ and not something to be dismissed as, oh yeah, everyone would know how this works. And you still need to know that this rule exists in the FAQ, which new players may not. This was why Games Workshop had to get it right the first time, and they haven't. And that's very disappointing for the start of the edition. For anything that refers to causing a desperate escape test, the unit has to make a hazard roll for each model in the unit, and then they have to take a battle shock test. What it doesn't tell us is what's meant to happen if you get to re-roll the desperate escape test. Do you get to re-roll all the hazard rolls? Do you get to re-roll the battle shock test that was caused by this desperate escape test? How does that work for the Dark Angels? I don't think anyone on the balance team remembered the Dark Angels. Now one that affects the Death Watch and the Genestealer Cult especially. If the unit began the game on the battlefield and was moved into strategic reserves in the first round, Can they do an ingress move to arrive back on the battlefield in the first battle round? The answer is no, which is different to 10th edition, unless they have an ability that requires them to do so. So Genestealer Cult units or Tyranids using resistance tunnels to burrow away in the first turn cannot come back in your first turn. The Death Watch in the Black Spear Task Force can use side-to-side teleportation to move up to 2 kill team units or another infantry unit into reserves. We could do this in the first turn, but there's no requirement to bring them back onto the table, so even though they have Deep Strike until the end of our next movement phase, you'll lose that aspect because you won't be able to bring them on in turn 1. You'll have to wait until turn 2, and then they won't have Deep Strike. However, if you're playing Imperial Agents Death Watch and you use Rapid Tactical Relocation, there you have to set them up in the reinforcement step of your next movement phase, anywhere on the battlefield, so they can come back in turn 1. Right, here's a change that took me a long time to understand why there was any reason to include it and what the implications were, until my Genestealer Cult neophyte brain kicked in. When you're doing things at the end of the phase or the end of the turn, the very first thing you do is determine which objectives are controlled by the player, then you do any other abilities. So if we're trying to score victory points in the command phase, and we're not the Genestealer Cult, we're the Necrons, and we don't control an objective, we won't get any victory points from it, then Reanimation Protocol happens at the end of the phase, where we could go on to that objective, but the point where we could score points for controlling that objective has already passed. That's what this controlling an objective at the end of the phase does. It's another nerf for the Necrons, though not one that will affect the Genestealer Cult because the Neophyte's Cult icon is a unit ability you use at any time in the command phase, so it will come in the ability step, which is before the end of the phase. We regenerate, then we score victory points, then anything else that happens at the end of the command phase happens. We're just better. Now we're going to move on to the more controversial stuff surrounding returning characters. There's an update to 2.2.4 on healing and regaining lost wounds, which is fine, which I'm okay with. You cannot return character models. This matches things like the Hospitaler's ability. You can bring back models, but you can't bring back character models. This makes everything the same, and importantly, it stops reanimation protocols from bringing back Necron characters that were precisioned out of the unit. That's all fine. The bit that's not fine is any effects that revive destroyed character models. Protocol of the Eternal Revenant, Divine Intervention, things like that. You set up the destroyed model on the battlefield, unengaged, and not part of the attached unit, and its starting strength is 1. So you cannot heal beyond that one model. It is at max strength. It means it won't need to take a battle shock test, but you can never return models. The Protocol of the Eternal Revenant is in the detachment where you get bonuses to your units if they're led by a character. Being able to bring back a character, but they're outside the unit, makes the stratagem relatively pointless. Your unit won't get the bonus anymore. It's problematic for Saint Celestine. It's possible she may be killed by precision. It's unlikely because as long as there's a Gemini alive, she has a 4+ invulnerable save, but she could be killed by precision, especially if the Gemini were dead. She then uses her natural ability to return, but now she's outside the unit. She cannot use her healing tears to restore anyone in the unit. She's at max strength, a max strength of 1. They really should come back in the unit. Positives, you have another unit that can complete actions and move around the table, and also, good and bad, mainly for sisters you get the good part, it's now 2 different units that can be destroyed and give you a miracle dice. Bad side, it's now 2 different units that can be killed that give up kill points. The enemy will score victory points for killing Celestine again, the enemy will score victory points for killing her Seraphim. And none of this fixes Divine Intervention, which you use on a character unit when the unit is destroyed, but you bring back the most recently destroyed model. It also means, intentionally or not, if you had a unit of Battle Sisters with a Hospitaler, and they were all destroyed, and the Hospitaler was the last model to be destroyed, you could use Divine Intervention, bring her back, but she couldn't then heal anyone because she's at max strength. And if she had been precisioned out of the unit, and then the unit was destroyed, you couldn't use this stratagem because once the Hospitaler is dead, it loses the character keyword. Remember that FAQ from earlier in the video? It's no longer a character unit. So you're not going to be able to bring back one battle sister at starting strength 1 that's never going to take a battle shock test and can sit on an objective and generate miracle dice with a simulacrum. That's a difficult one, and that makes things worse for the sisters. We're going to end with the army rule changes to the sisters and the Genestealer Cult. But if you want to use any of these rules, that is up to you. I say again, this is an event FAQ which Games Workshop is using to playtest its 11th edition rules at this event. It is not a global FAQ. If you and your opponent want to apply one of these rules to your game, you can because it's your game. But if someone at a different event in Farringdon-cum-Blythe tries to use this FAQ instead of any tournament rules specifically for the FCB location event, nope, you are not playing at Tacoma. Are you planning to use these rules in your everyday games? And if you are going to the Tacoma event, how do you feel about paying for an event where you are a playtester for Games Workshop? Is it good that you get to use the probable latest version of the rules? Annoyed that Games Workshop is using you? Or as they say in Tacoma, it's whatever dude, I'm here to have fun in the 253. Okay, Genestealer Cult. The army rule fix. The problem with the army rule was that you couldn't bring back a unit that had a character attached, because every model in the unit needed to have the Cult Ambush rule. Characters did not have the Cult Ambush rule, so you could never use Cult Ambush on a unit that had a character. This FAQ says, when you're checking if every model in the destroyed unit has the Cult Ambush rule, exclude any character models. And when determining how many resurgence points to spend, ignore the character models. Because there is no option to bring back 11 models, 10 acolytes plus something else. And characters don't come back. Essentially, these words mean it's the same as in 10th edition. Almost. When your Primus and 10 acolytes unit dies, you can bring back the 10 acolytes for 4 resurgence points. But the thing that'll be different in 11th edition compared to 10th edition, when the unit is destroyed is weird. The unit's only destroyed when the last model in that unit is destroyed. So you'll have a situation where you're waiting for the character to be killed, even though all of the models that are going to come back through Cult Ambush are already gone. They're waiting in the wings, but you cannot spend resurgence points on them because their unit is not destroyed yet, and characters and bodyguards are one unit for all purposes in 11th edition. That'll be the different weird thing. Otherwise, it now works the same as in 10th edition. Good. Less good news for the Adeptus Sororitas. We have a problem where we have fewer miracle dice than last edition because we don't get any miracle dice from dead characters. When a unit was destroyed, they split into their character and unit self. Each of them was destroyed, and so you got a miracle dice for the Canoness, a miracle dice for the Hospitaller, and a miracle dice for the dead Battle Sisters. In 11th edition, you just get the one miracle dice for the whole group. That hasn't changed with this FAQ. And miracle dice in 10th edition were already worse than 9th edition, where you could use a miracle dice of a 1 to pass Battle Shock. Low miracle dice don't do much in 10th or 11th edition. So I do expect that miracle dice will go away when we get the Codex, as Eldar Fate dice went away. Now this FAQ clarifies that 11th edition is worse for the Battle Sisters than 10th edition when it comes to miracle dice. You make the substitution of a hit roll before you roll any attacks in that grouping. Same for the wound roll, same for the save roll. So if you're making 3 save rolls, and your model has 2 wounds, you can't roll a save, see if it's passed, then use a miracle dice to pass another one, so that even if the third one is failed, you would only take 1 wound. Now you've got to decide if you use a miracle dice on the save roll before you make any other saves. So we'll use a miracle dice to pass the first one, or we failed the other 2, the character's dead, and we've wasted a miracle dice. Because damage isn't fast rolled, where you don't roll all the damage at once and then assign lowest to highest, you roll damage one at a time, and when you're making damage rolls, you can substitute a dice for a single damage roll before you make the roll. So in that case, you could have a 14 wound enemy model, roll a damage, get a 6, roll a damage, get a 3, and then use a miracle dice of a 6 to guarantee destroying it. That's because it's any single damage roll before you make that roll, rather than using a miracle dice before you make a group of rolls. That's my interpretation. And when it says a single damage roll, that doesn't mean that the Army of Faith detachment rule no longer applies. Just in regular circumstances, where you have 1 act of faith per unit per phase, you can swap out a dice before you make any individual damage roll. That is my interpretation. So yes, things are a little bit worse in theory for the Adeptus Sororitas. Plus we have to pay for melter guns and no one else does. Plus some of our combos are very expensive. You can see all of the changes that have been made to the Adeptus Sororitas officially in this video. And I will have Adeptus Sororitas videos coming soon. Don't you worry. And when we get the proper FAQ at the end of July, then we'll get some fixes, and that should help you to have a great day of 40k.